Gonna be honest here, I thought Rogu was gonna win, but you voted for Roger, so let's get this show started. Hello everyone and welcome to the Void Theater. As always, I'm your host, Alexander, and after a 3-month hiatus on the show, I am finally back to talk about American Dad, but more specifically, Roger the Alien. Now, I can't really think of anyone who's changed the show as fundamentally as Roger. Everything from the show's intro to the way the episodes are structured was drastically changed with his development over the course of the show's runtime. And that's nothing compared to the adoration he's received from the show's fanbase. I know this because you've all let me know. Time and time and time and time again. My God, you people are persistent. But the thing is, when people talk about how Roger defined the show and made it better, it's usually pretty one-dimensional. Most people just say that his personas made the show funnier because they all had such crazy personalities that they were vastly different from each other. And while I do agree with that sentiment to an extent, the fact is that Roger's personas, while a major part of his character, are only a small part of how he changed American Dad from a more by-the-numbers sitcom into something that's more easily recognizable. But what exactly is it with Roger that not only makes him so recognizable and beloved, but also so defining for the show that they redesigned the actual intro to feature more of him? And that's where I come in, because what I'm going to do is break down Roger and the impacts he's had on the show, both in and out of his various personalities and the abilities and problems he has as an alien, while also talking about how he saved American Dad from a problem far too many animated sitcoms go through. But now that we've got the basics out of the way, we can begin. So without any further ado, let's raise the curtain and put this alien on stage and see how he plays out. Alright, so the best place to start would be by addressing a simple fact, and it's that before Roger got his personas, he had zero real impact on the show. It's something I covered in my first video on the show where I talk about him being more of a side character than a main one, but it was a problem that both he and Klaus had early on. Bear in mind though that this was far earlier in the show's lifespan. But when you go back to watch the earlier seasons, it's painfully obvious that the writers came up with the idea of Roger first and his personality second. And while this worked for when the show had a much more subtle approach to comedy, if I'm being honest, it also made him one of the more forgettable characters. The best thing he had going for him at the time was the fact that he was an alien, and even then, it never really did much for him, aside from the golden poop, but even then you could chalk that up to the writers from the later seasons wanting to see it come full circle. But the point still remains that he was just kind of there. But on the other hand, I think that worked for the show at the time. See, back in the earlier seasons, the show was working at a much slower pace in terms of comedy, and Roger himself was a reflection of that. His personas were there, but they were far less exotic. Usually they were just costumes, something he could slip into so he could leave the house without issue. There were some notable exceptions to the rule like the Sidney Huffman persona, but remember this was an anomaly at the time. Even in that episode, Roger genuinely seems surprised that his personas can spawn a life of their own, and says that it's not supposed to happen.
I'm Sidney! One of my personas has taken on a life of its own!
And okay, but what does that have to do with Roger defining American Dad? Well, when talking about Roger's personas, you can't ignore the most famous one of all, and funny enough, I think this is when Roger started to have a much bigger influence on the show. Of course, I'm talking about Ricky Spanish. Now again, I want to be clear here and say that yes, by this point Roger did have personas that had their own identities and lives. But with most of them, there was almost this unspoken rule that they were still somehow connected to the family in some way. With Max Jets, he was the Smith's financial backer, and with the Leg Man, he repeatedly broke character and admitted that it was essentially a game between himself and Steve. But then you get to Ricky Spanish, and that's where the change really started to take place, because this was arguably the first character that had no real connection to the Smiths. This was also around a time that the point and the plot of the show really seemed to stop relying on the weird situations coming from Stan and the CIA, and started letting a lot of the odder parts of the show stem from Roger and his various personalities. It's something that becomes noticeably obvious when you compare the earlier seasons with the later ones. Now, it begs the question of whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. And I don't have an answer because the truth is, it's entirely dependent on how you feel about the change in American Dad's style of humor. If you enjoyed the more subtle political style comedy of the older seasons, then you probably don't like a lot of the newer episodes because they stray far away from that with some obvious minor exceptions. On the other hand, if you enjoy crazier humor, then this is probably right up your alley because Roger is the epitome of insane, wacky humor. And I'm not here to judge you if you do. I enjoy both old and new American Dad in a fairly equal regard. But I do notice that a lot of people chalk up the change in the show's writing and tone to one of the showrunners leaving. And while I do think the departure was a major contributing factor, I don't think that enough credit is given to how Roger also played a significant part in that change. Once Roger's outfits stopped being just outfits and started being full-on people, the show then had to adapt to that change and redefine its sense of style. And in a way, it feels like this was always where the show was headed. And you can kind of see that change in certain episodes. Take some of the non-canon episodes, for example. Tearjerker and For Black Eyes Only feel like something Stan would imagine while doing paperwork at the CIA. They're still out there, but they're not all that crazy. Now compare that to a later season episode like The 200, an episode whose entire plot centers exclusively around Roger, and it's far crazier in almost every regard. It's not a bad episode in any sense of the word. Honestly, it's probably one of my favorite out there stories in American Dad, but you can see and feel the difference in how the episode is structured. The plot and the humor both feel far more random than usual, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that Roger is at the helm in this episode. The entire plot only happens because of Roger. Now, does this mean that Ricky Spanish is a bad episode and the cause for the change in American Dad's writing? Well, no. Because saying that to a group of American Dad fans is like telling Rick and Morty fans that the show isn't that funny. A good way for a degenerate like me to end up on a cross.
Laugh, little children, laugh!
But what I am saying is that Roger's personas played a heavy part in how the show would end up changing over the years. And a lot of the changes started when Roger's personas stopped being costumes and started taking on actual lives of their own. Now again, whether or not that change is good or bad depends on how you view the later seasons. But I think we can agree Roger's personas played a rather large part in defining American Dad the longer the show went on. Which is only slightly ironic considering the second part of his character played a much larger part in the series. Which actually brings us to our second part of the video, which is the fact that Roger is an alien. I know, hold those gasps, this information is shocking. All joking aside though, it's really weird how often that fact seems to just pass by people when they talk about the character. And I get it, Roger being an alien is like Brian being a dog. It's obvious at face value. But the difference is that Brian being a dog has never fundamentally changed Family Guy the same way Roger being an alien has. And I don't say that lightly considering the fact that Roger being an alien has directly been responsible for massive shifts in American Dad. Both the creation of Rogu and Jeff's kidnapping are direct results of Roger's alien origins. And again, that's also not including the entire sub-story of the Golden Poop that spanned multiple seasons. But okay, what does that have to do with Roger defining American Dad? Well, the thing is that like Roger's personas, him being an alien was far subtler in the earlier seasons, before changing into the more obvious aspect on the show now. See, in the earlier seasons, Roger being an alien was seen as something that could never be known. Roger was kept in the attic away from people, and when he was around the house, he would hide away in cabinets and cupboards to make sure people didn't see him roaming around. But now there are multiple people who at the very least are seemingly aware of Roger being an alien. Dr. Calgary seems to be at the very least aware, and Toshi actively acknowledges it.
Harry, Toshi, you know my Uncle Roger?
ああ、ずらかぶった宇宙人だろ
And I promise that as nonsensical as this is, it will make sense later, but just bear with me for now. But the point I'm making is that like Roger's personas, his abilities and characteristics went from something that had to be hidden to something that was just kind of there. It's a rather drastic change, but it's also another example of Roger redefining the show. Like I said, in the earlier seasons, Roger being an alien and in the same vein his alien powers were treated like his personas, a secondary thing mainly used for gags that has now essentially taken on a life of its own. It's gone from things like Roger being slightly fireproof to being able to duplicate himself to help with chores. And yes, I will get to that little abomination at some point. But it's these kind of changes that defined American Dad in the later seasons. It's something even the writers seem to be aware of considering the numerous episodes where Stan asks if he actually has to go to work. It's something that started off as more of a lighthearted joke in the earlier seasons, but became far more prevalent as the show went on. And that's mainly due to the fact that the longer the show went on, the more Roger dominated the show and took away from the CIA aspect of it. And even when it does start to focus on that aspect, Roger can still sometimes worm his way into it. But that brings us back to the topic at hand. How did Roger come to define American Dad? And the answer here is rather simple. Roger is a cheat code when it comes to the issue that nearly all cartoon sitcoms struggle with. The issue of character diversity. Now, just to clarify, when I talk about character diversity, I'm not referring to the race of the characters in the show, but more so the number of characters in a show. It's something a lot of animated sitcoms struggle with mainly because it's a necessity to flesh out the world and create interesting stories, but you also don't want the characters to wear out their welcome on the show and in turn drag the overall quality down. And different shows deal with it in different ways. In the case of shows like Futurama and Rick and Morty, they usually deal with this by having the main cast go off-world and explore different planets and dimensions. And in the case of slightly more grounded shows like Family Guy and King of the Hill, they focus on making the characters more developed and memorable. Which brings us back to Roger. And this is what I mean by cheat code, because Roger is the best of both worlds. If the writers ever want to take a break from focusing on Stan and the CIA and do something weirder in the vein of Rick and Morty, then they can just focus on some weird aspect of Roger being an alien. Or if they decide they want to have a crazy new character who will occasionally make some sporadic appearances, then they can just have Roger jump into a new persona. It's something they've been doing more and more in the later seasons, which is why you have a character like Raider Dave making repeat appearances. But that also circles back into him defining the show, because by relying on his personas and his alien powers, they also had to bring him further and further into the limelight, which when looking at his progression in the show seems entirely likely. Season 1, he was an odd standout that had his moments. Newer seasons? Well, half the episodes in them are literally just Roger themed episodes. Now, like I've said throughout this entire video, whether or not this is a good thing depends on why you enjoyed American Dad. If you liked it for its far more subtle political references, then you're probably not going to like the fact that Roger became a defining part of the show. But on the other hand, if you enjoy the more out there random style humor, then you'll probably get a kick out of it. I'm not here to judge, just to overanalyze. But with that, we come to the current call on Roger, the alien that defined American Dad. I know it took a long time for another American Dad video to come out, and I am sorry for that, but in YouTube you never want to be known as a one-trick pony. That being said, I did have fun with this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. I still have some other characters left that I have to do with this show, so expect some more American Dad videos down the line. But as always, with the current closing, I'll leave you with a question. Which do you prefer when it comes to American Dad? Are you a fan of the older seasons or the newer? Leave a comment down below and let me know what you think. And while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe for more content like this. And follow me on Twitter for more updates. And of course, a very happy new year. But until next time, I've been your host Alexander, and I hope to see you back in my theater.